All right, great. Thank you everyone for joining. We're still seeing people trickle in, but as we get started, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Aisha Balagan. I'm the Special Projects Associate at the Housing Solutions Lab, and I'm here excited to co-host this webinar with Claudia Aiken, our Director of New Research Partnerships. So we're also excited to keep Climate Week going with this webinar on how local governments can advance both housing goals and climate goals in their work. We'll first give just a brief presentation that'll give an overview of how housing and climate are connected. And then I'll turn it over to Claudia to facilitate a discussion with our two panelists today, Wilson Kimball from the Municipal Housing Authority for the City of Yonkers, and Dana Sjostrom from the Department of Memphis and Shelby County. And I may have completely butchered your name, Dana. I'm so sorry. Their discussion will kind of highlight strategies and best practices and lessons learned from their local initiatives regarding housing and climate. And at the end, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A, so definitely submit your questions as we go. We hope you'll leave this webinar with a kind of initial idea of how to begin or deepen initiatives in your community regarding housing and climate. So to just get us started here, a little bit about the lab. We're a team of researchers at the NYU Furman Center, that's New York University, and we help small to mid-sized cities plan, launch, and evaluate local housing policies. One branch of our work kind of includes evaluating the intersection of housing policy with other policy sectors, and that includes climate. So I'll walk you through some of our foundational work on climate so far. Now, one of our first big takeaways is that although the climate and housing sectors may share many goals, they often pursue their work in silos. And we've seen many reasons why this is the case. The first being differing timescales. Housing practitioners and climate practitioners are often faced with projects that measure success over vastly different scales of time, and this can stifle initial buy-in and collaboration. We've also seen the issue of complex funding. Climate resources in particular tend to filter through many levels of government, each applying their own restrictions, their own regulations on how these funds can be used. And that can make it really difficult for small to mid-sized cities with limited staff resources to fully utilize these funds for climate and housing initiatives. We've also seen the difficulty that can come with navigating stakeholders. We're kind of using the word climate as a big catch-all here, but in reality, there are many subcategories of stakeholders and work within this umbrella, sustainability, disaster recovery, what have you. And each subcategory can have their own lingo, their own goals, which can make it difficult for those of us situated in the housing world to navigate. So there are some very real consequences for the lack of collaboration between housing and climate. One of which being the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA. Now, the IRA makes several new pots of funding available that can advance housing climate initiatives across the country. But the concern is that many communities may not have the infrastructure and partnerships already in place to fully leverage these funds for climate housing initiatives. At the lab, we definitely believe that good technical assistance and good long-term policy depends on folks from the climate and housing sectors working together. To that end, we've been working on building out resources and opportunities to engage with cities around the intersection of housing and climate. And part of our first phase of this work has included drafting a representation of how climate goals relate to housing policy and action. And here's a framework we've developed in that realm. So you'll see 3 goals in the circles on top that kind of detail some of the goals that climate and housing can share. And then in that arrow in the middle, you'll see 3 characteristics of housing that policy can modulate to meet these goals. And I'll go into a little more detail on each of these on the following slides. So the first goal is protecting physical safety by reducing exposure to immediate climate risks. This speaks to the short-term needs that both the housing sectors and the climate sector face in keeping people safe. So when we talk about housing location in this context, this can refer to rehabilitating or relocating housing that's currently in high-risk areas. This could look like updating permitting processes or adapting proactive managed retreat strategies. Moving on, attention to housing design and construction can help housing withstand local climate risks. So one way we've seen cities do this is through revising their building codes. And lastly, changes in housing operation can help maintain healthy indoor environments and protect families against threats like mold or extreme climate or extreme weather, I should say. So the next goal is ensuring long-term sustainability by reducing housing-related greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the big thing to emphasize here is housing location, right? Locating housing near jobs, goods, and services can help lessen transportation demands and thus help lessen the greenhouse gas emissions associated with transportation of goods, people, and services. So policies like zoning for housing density, mixed use developments, and facilitating access to public transportation can really help lessen the indirect emissions associated with housing development. Now, for housing design and construction, this really speaks to sustainable building practices and how housing policy can incentivize or regulate these. So we've seen a handful of cities use energy efficiency standards and update their building codes to this end. For housing operation, this primarily refers to how housing policy can regulate or incentivize energy efficient appliances or clean energy use in a residential setting. Now, the last goal is enable equitable disaster response and recovery to help communities achieve greater resilience in the future. Now, the focus here is on, after disaster occurs, we should be trying to rebuild cities in a way that's better than where they started. So for housing location, cities can consider policies that really tackle the intersections of place, climate vulnerability, and social vulnerability. This will look different for every community, but things like inclusionary zoning and post-disaster managed retreat strategies could be initial policies for cities to look into. Now, policies around design and construction can help make sure that diverse housing types are built and rebuilt after disaster strikes, and this can help maintain affordability across a range of incomes in each community. Lastly, under housing operation, policies that support weatherized, energy efficient homes, particularly in underinvested communities, can help maintain a housing stock in these areas that has high housing quality, remains resilient, and remains affordable to those who live there. So you can read more about this framework by scanning the QR code currently on the slide. And that link will also take you to the landing page for more resources that the lab has developed on climate and housing. So what's next for housing and climate? We hope that this framework will help climate and housers develop a similar language around their projects and initiatives and stimulate comprehensive action. But we also know that a similar language is not enough to actually ensure that these partnerships will take place. So some of the lab's current research focuses on how housing climate partnerships form and what makes them successful. And in a moment, we'll turn it to Claudia and our panelists for a conversation that will provide a deeper dive on the strengths, challenges, and impacts of some of the climate housing initiatives they've implemented in their communities. But before we do that, we do want to get input from you, our audience, on what resources would be most helpful in your own climate and housing initiatives in your community. So in a moment, you'll see a Zoom poll kind of pop up, and we'd love your feedback. Thank you, Claudia. And as you fill that out, we just want to say thank you for listening. And I also want to give a big shout out to the people at the lab and the Furman Center that helped make this work possible. Thank you, Jess Wunsch, Brian Brenner, Donna Borak, Nikki Miller, Claudia Zakaria, and Tony Budilovic for all of your help. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, I will turn it to Claudia and our panelists for their conversation.
Fabulous. Thanks, Aisha. And everyone, just a reminder that there will be a time for your questions in just a little bit. So please be entering those. They could be questions for Aisha, for myself, but also for our panelists who have firsthand on-the-ground experience that they can share. So be entering those in the next few minutes. But now I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists. Wilson Kimball is President and CEO of the Municipal Housing Authority for the City of Yonkers, New York. Her organization has collaborated with Groundwork Hudson Valley to implement green infrastructure upgrades that mitigate the impact of climate change for affordable housing residents. And the Yonkers Housing Authority has also been a pioneer in sustainable construction, and Wilson will tell us more about that. Before her time at the Housing Authority, she was the Commissioner of Planning and Development for the City of Yonkers. Our other wonderful panelist, Dana Sjostrom, is Planning and Programs Manager for the Memphis and Shelby County Department of Housing in Tennessee, where she is leading efforts to address energy burdens and home repair needs. Dana has a background in educating, training, and providing technical assistance around coastal resilience and environmental science. She is also currently pursuing a PhD at the University of Memphis, focusing on engaged research around embedding sustainability principles and centering resident benefits in local government decision-making. So we're so delighted to have you both here. And Wilson, I'm going to turn to you first, actually, just to hopefully talk a bit more about your current partnership with Groundwork Hudson Valley. Can you tell us about the work that you've done together and give us a sense of the impact that you're seeing so far?
Sure. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, NYU, for having us today, and Housing Solutions Lab. We have been working with Groundwork Hudson Valley on a number of issues, everything from building bioswales to help remediate the flooding issues in our townhouses. We have 1,700 units that we own and operate, and another 5,000 Section 8 vouchers that we administer. So we've been working with Groundwork Hudson Valley in the last 4 years since I've been there to remediate flooding, which is a primary problem in Yonkers, not because of the four rivers, not the Hudson or the Bronx or the Sprain or the Sawmill, but actually because of extreme weather patterns that bring large amounts of water in a quick period of time, thus backing up the combined water and sewer systems. So we've had a number of disastrous floods, millions of dollars of damage, and Groundworks has really helped us with planting tree canopy so that the roots would absorb some of the runoff. We have worked with them on air quality. We're currently doing a project with them on testing air quality by providing space at municipal housing buildings for their air quality monitors. We've also worked with them to study the impact of heat island effect in Southwest Yonkers, which was a traditionally redlined area, and look at the impact of heat island effect on housing and tenants. And then that would also be, the impact of tree canopy, air quality, trips to the hospital. There is a direct link between increasing temperatures and decreasing scores on standardized tests. So we're looking at all those things together. And it's a very exciting project that's been going on for several years, and I think it'll continue to grow and blossom.
That's terrific. And so Dana, in Memphis, you've been working with partners also, in your case, to develop a new way of prioritizing vulnerable residents for limited home rehab funds, and to make sure that those repairs address energy burdens in a measurable way. So could you tell us a little bit more about those efforts and the impact you're seeing?
Absolutely, thanks. And it's an honor to be here to represent our team's work in this space. And it's an interesting place to be in. We manage a number of federal and local funding sources, and so with those come a lot of strings attached, of course, as you can imagine. So we've moved our home rehabilitation program from a first come first served model, which is horribly inequitable, but it's often out of necessity how we need to get people in the door to serve eligible low to moderate income folks. And just as a quick note about Memphis context, we have a quarter of our population living in poverty, and we have a child poverty rate twice the national average. So there's a lot of housing needs, and you can imagine that with limited income comes lack of ability to maintain those homes. So what we're seeing, we have a lot of just people that call us in need of home repairs. And so what we do is we keep a notification list, and we make sure that we create touch points for those people at a time in the future that we can provide assistance. And so we're slowly scaling that up. And so what we're doing is incorporating a vulnerability index into how we sort homes and homeowners into a list that prioritizes things like age of the resident, age of the house, the housing self-reported housing problems. We incorporate energy burden, and so housing cost burden into that, and the census tract in which they live. We incorporate their, if you're located in a census tract that's lower income, then you get prioritized as well. So all of these come together as sort of a weighted Z-score that allows us to help people more in need. We have hundreds and hundreds of people on this notification list, for instance, so we constantly try to chase additional dollars to really address that need. We were recently asked by some of our leadership to come up with a scale of the problem. And so even just taking Shelby County, Tennessee, and assessors data, we came up with a $2.5 billion price tag just to stabilize the housing stock. So, and that's just in residential buildings. So it's something to consider, trying to figure out how to prioritize who we serve and making that a more equitable process. So that's been pretty successful, and we just keep trying to scale up the ability to serve more residents in need.
That's so helpful. And back to you, Wilson. You've worked at multiple scales of Yonkers' kind of housing ecosystem, both in your current role overseeing a housing authority and also previously as a leader in citywide planning efforts. So given that experience, what role would you say that housing departments and agencies can play in community-wide climate resilience efforts?
Well, I think there has to be political will at the very top. I was able to work for Mayor Mike Spano in Yonkers. He had a real vision and leadership on the climate resiliency area. We did all LED streetlights before anyone else in Westchester, and then we made the RFP that we used available to other communities so that they didn't have to reinvent the wheel. He has been adding parkland, adding tree cover. He's really committed to that. He helped and co-funded with other sources our first passive house, affordable housing for seniors. Through home monies. So his support has been a huge part of it. He convinced the building department to pass, some ordinances and make the building code more conducive to solar panels for private home ownership. He helped us with getting community solar in our buildings to be the beneficiary of community solar. So I think there has to be a political will there. It has to be driven by the top. Having said that, many politicians are now understanding how important that is both to their constituents and to their community. And so I think that if a well-organized group of people, went to their mayor or county leader or, town supervisor and expressed, the benefits of being climate resilient, it doesn't take too much to understand the value of that these days. All one has to do is watch the news, right? To understand this is a bipartisan issue. This is impacting everyone. And it's good for, your constituents to care about your community on a sort of more earthen level.
Totally. Yeah. And I remember when we talked, you also said something which really perked my ears up about how, as a housing authority, you've been pushing for zoning changes that make solar more feasible, not just for housing authority owned properties, but really for affordable housing across the board.
Yes, I mean, since we have 5,000 Section 8 vouchers, we have a lot of interaction with private landlords. So we're able to work with NYSERDA and the New York energy department and go to our private landlords and say, listen, NYSERDA has this program, NYSERDA has that program. We'll blast out the information. It comes in both English and Spanish, whatever you need. How can we help? Because we know it helps our tenants too down the road. And it also helps, with all of our bills and our, use of fossil fuel reduction. So, I mean, it's helping everybody. And I think when we talked before, Claudia, I also said, like, you shouldn't be competitive about your ideas. You should not have ownership alone, because no single person or organization can do it alone. So seek partners, go to those Section 8 landlords that probably do want to improve their building, but they're trying to figure out the funding. As Dana said, like, there's money out there, but only if we team up. And so we have to become creative about solving these problems. We can't live in a silo.
Absolutely. And I can't imagine a more perfect segue because Dana, we were actually going to ask you about funding. When we spoke previously, you mentioned some of the opportunities, but also challenges around layering different sources of funding that may be, intended for climate or housing activities. And then how do you make sure that you're repairing homes, but also weatherizing them, and so accomplishing both sets of goals? And so can you talk a bit more about that, and also what strategies may have helped?
Certainly, and Wilson makes a great point. This is really a better effort if we're in it together. And so our particular set of funds from entitlement grants involve community development block grant and home investment partnerships program funds, which require that we bring the house up to code. So we then have a lot of deferrals where if it's above our program limits, we have to walk away from that homeowner, and that's a devastating prospect. And it's not fun ever. It's the worst part of our job. And so those funding restrictions mean that other programs also have issues with their strings. So for instance, we work closely with the City of Memphis's weatherization assistance program. Those are Department of Energy funds, and so they have very restrictive requirements to only weatherize homes. But when you're dealing with housing stock that's so depressed and so dilapidated that we need to fix the structural systems first before we can actually weatherize it. So that's where we're trying to team up and have a place where our deferrals can go. Our department is also going to be managing the Solar for All funds. And so that's going to allow us to do things targeted to that effort in upgrading electrical systems, stabilizing roofs for residential rooftop solar. But then we can also feed those clients through other programs after that's done. So if we can get in with these Solar for All funds, for instance, and just stabilize the roof, that takes $10,000 off a rehab cost. So then maybe that homeowner is now eligible for other services that we can go in and fix other health and safety issues or code compliance issues that aren't necessarily a priority for Solar for All. So it's layering these different types of things. It's chasing other pots of money to make things like a minor home repair program possible, where we can go in after we have so many calls after freeze events, for instance, and these poorly insulated homes we have so many pipes break, and it's a devastating cost to those homeowners. And we have homeowners living with active leaks that we just cannot get to fast enough. So the community need really speaks to what we spend our time, what keeps us up at night, and what funding sources we really try to chase to make these interventions that matter to people. So yeah, it's a great point to work together to figure out how to meet community need in a more comprehensive way.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. Well, I'm seeing some great questions in the chat. Please keep those coming, folks. I promise I'll only dominate for a little while longer. But I want to make sure that we ask you, Wilson, about your work with modular passive housing at La Mora Senior Apartments. I'd love to know just if there were any unexpected challenges you faced while developing that property, and also what lessons you might be bringing forward to your next development.
Oh my goodness, so many lessons, so many problems. Sure. So we decided we were going to build senior housing because the demographic studies that the Westchester County Housing Needs Assessment showed was that our population is aging. They'd prefer to age in place. I think that's happening in a lot of communities in America. So they should have good quality housing. I had been in Yonkers for about a decade and seen a number of weird climate things like a freak snowstorm in November that disabled the roads, and people were abandoning their cars, and school children were left on school buses for hours, and people were stranded at the library. And so I decided I really wanted some kind of building, a passive house building where, you know, if we had a generator, we could help our seniors who have, in some cases, life-sustaining medications or machines that they need to be sure are fully functional in the worst case scenario. And sometimes we can't reach them in these like very unusual climate problems. So we decided to change the architecture from the original, which was just going to be a standard senior housing, to passive house. When I got there, I was pushing for that. And so we did, and then we discovered that we could do it modular, and we had the units shipped in from Pennsylvania. And what happened was our contractor surveyor put the building 10 feet in the wrong place. So that was the first of many problems, because once that happened, we had to go back and get all the land use approvals redone. And then also that shifted where our parking lot was. We lost parking spaces, and we found an underground storage tank, which I call the whale, 50,000 gallon tank that had been abandoned, wasn't even on the city charts. We were only able to locate it through Westchester County. With my staff did an amazing job trying to even find this thing listed anywhere. And then of course the EPA had to come in, which is always unexpected and not always as successful as this interaction. So that was helpful. And we're still learning lessons. You know, we're still figuring it out. We're still working through the little glitches of opening a building. It's 60 units and 58 people have moved in. So it's a lesson, and we are continuing to learn from it. We have also designed our next senior 92 unit passive house building, which will be called the Willow. And that will probably start construction next year, because we're working with New York State Housing and Community Renewal to close this year. So I don't have all the lessons yet, Claudia, but I would say, you know, come back. Anyone's welcome. Come back, reach out, and we'll give you tours, and we'll talk through the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there's a little bit of everything in that.
Wow, you may not have all the lessons, but you do have a story to tell. That's amazing. Well, I just have one more question, and this is really for both of you. I'd like to know, what advice would you give other communities interested in forging local partnerships to address both housing and climate goals? And maybe we'll go to you first, Dana.
Certainly. And I think it's interesting. A lot of those of us that work in the climate space, and especially in local adaptation efforts, really have to remember that those bigger climate goals really don't matter to people that are struggling to pay their bills. And so to remember what is important to people. And if we look at the numbers, you know, a third of our greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, come as it relates to energy use, comes from residential buildings. So there's huge opportunity there in the housing space then to have climate goals that also have impacts on people's bottom lines. So if you're, what are your constituent, or what are your elected officials, for instance, hearing from their constituents? Is it that I can't afford my utility bill, I can't afford my house, I don't have enough affordable housing choice? So how can we fix that? How can we make land use decisions to incentivize infill? For instance, we have a lot of vacant parcels that I know a lot of other metros might not have, but that's, instead of looking at it as a blighted liability, let's look at it as an asset and figure out how we can stimulate that production of new units or energy efficient units. So it's figuring out, I think, in the boundary spanning world that I was working in also, and still do to this day, it's thinking of how to broker that knowledge and making those investments and making it matter to people. So I think one of the biggest things is helping connect it to the human part of that story, and making the impact on the resident mean more than the climate goal itself, but then also having the climate benefit of reduced greenhouse gas emissions, reduced energy consumption, which helps people day to day live healthier lives.
Yeah, that feels very poignant and true, and actually makes me think of a question that I had that I totally skipped over, which was really around the language that we use, and how, especially in some contexts, even the word green or, you know, carbon footprint can be polarizing. So how do we navigate that? But I think you addressed it.
That's right. Yeah, making it matter to people is the universal truth. So that's the easier part of that.
Yeah. All right, Wilson, what do you got?
Well, I think, it's a theme that I harp on regularly. You have to look for unconventional partners. Groundwork, Hudson Valley, obviously, and the Housing Authority may not seem like typical partners, but they ended up being great partners, and we help each other and push each other and strive. We've partnered with the Yonkers Public Library to provide books for our seniors in large print in like Spanish language. We've worked with DPW about looking at new ways to handle garbage and recyclables and even composting. So there are groups out there that may not seem like obvious partners, and yet, just what Dana said, like if you're able to think outside the box, then you're sort of able to come to sort of some accord on what your mission is, and you can be coming from for different reasons and from different directions, right, left, or center. I think what Dana said is brilliant. What keeps us up at night is what's happening to our planet, and we can all be a part of fixing that if we work together.
Wow, I love that. Unconventional partners for sure. And I'm now going to pass it back to Aisha to facilitate the participant Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Claudia. And thanks for the excellent discussion, Dana and Wilson. It was so great to be able to listen in on that. So to get started with some of these questions, I think maybe, going off of this thread of language, but also building willpower and building capacity. One question we have is, in my community, the equity question we often face is that many residents are struggling simply to keep a roof over their heads, and climate actions are simply out of reach for them. What are productive responses to this kind of question?
That's great. I can start if you'd like. That's something that we've been working a lot in and trying to figure out how to ground our work in something that is tangible. And like that example of using the vulnerability index and creating factors that allow us to meet the needs of those most in need first, or in order, in some sort of semblance of an order. But then connecting that, taking the lessons out of the climate action plan, for instance, or some of our larger sustainability plans, and connecting it back to what the day-to-day struggle is. And that's a healthier home environment, or one that they can, that people can afford to keep the lights on, that won't sleep at unsafe temperatures because of the cost of that. Urban heat island is a big issue. Those, for instance, in Chicago, with one of the heat events, those residents that passed away at a higher rate are isolated seniors that live in substandard housing conditions. So bringing back the climate goal through to actionability, where it matters to a human that is living in a home that needs to get good sleep so that they can make it to work on time or feed their families. That's the important thing, I think, there.
I don't have nearly as eloquent a response. I would just say, and no task is too big or too small. So if you're having trouble, supporting the home that you live in now, try to look for NYSERDA government grants that will help you do the improvements to your home that need to happen, because you might be spending too much on your gas bill, your electric bill, your whatever, because there's no insulation, or there's, some kind of leak or problem. And so to the extent that there is money flowing from the federal government, now is the time to access it. There is a lot of money out there. And I certainly understand it can be complex and difficult to navigate that, but there are people who can help you. And, just don't be afraid to ask, and don't be afraid to admit that you don't know, because I feel like so many times, if people had just asked us, we could have really saved them time and saved them money, because we are the ones who know where that money is. And maybe your local mayor's office, or your local supervisor's office, or county government, however it works in your state, they will know, and you can ask your elected person and they can help you.
Great. Thank you both. We actually just got, I think, a really interesting question going off of this issue of funding. This person is from a small local nonprofit, and they're worried about their nonprofit not fitting the vision of different funders, from foundations to higher levels of government. So I'm wondering if either of you have experience with pitching yourselves or your projects to funders, and what were the things that helped make that pitch successful?
Dana, you want to start?
No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I'm kind of relentless. I'm a dog with a bone. I don't take no for an answer. I will stalk people. I say that in the nicest way possible. And I also practice. I practice in front of a mirror, practice in front of my husband, practice in front of my coworkers. What is our message? How are we getting it out there? How is this the way I should present myself? Whatever. I do think also, and this is maybe a cynical take on it, but having worked in government for almost 30 years, oftentimes when you're pitching something to somebody, they want to know what is in it for them. I mean, and because they too have people that they report to or have to answer to. So if you can make your pitch help them help you, if it's a win-win, as my father used to say, then it's so much easier because they understand what they're doing and what you need, but they also understand why it benefits them to help you succeed. And so they're more likely to help you succeed for their own selfish reasons, perhaps, but nonetheless, it all works together, right? Rising tide lifts all boats.
That's great and such a great point. And I think I'll add, something that occurred to me while we were newly on this is if you have a particular, we manage both entitlement grants, which are formula funds, and also competitive grant processes. So we do both, right? So when we're writing grant proposals for competitive processes, sometimes, or if it's pitching to a foundation or what have you, you have to remember what those people want. So we know what we want to do, but does it fit that particular funding stream? And we can't be putting square pegs in round holes or trying to do something, even though we know it's what we really want to be doing. We have to make it matter to that funder. And so if that funder's priorities are equity or energy efficiency or dealing with deferrals or lead hazard reduction, we have to make sure that we're speaking that. So there's a place where sometimes we have to put ourselves aside and go, oh, I really want to do this thing over here. It's really important, but that funder wants this thing over here. So balancing that is always kind of a tough dancing game. But that's another thing that we have to do constantly is say, oh, that funding doesn't really fit what we want to do, but it's still useful. So we have to change the pitch a little bit to be responsive to what that particular entity wants and prioritizes.
For sure. Thank you so much. Keeping on this kind of thread on funding, we had one audience participant note that there seems to be a disconnect when and how housing funding is available versus when and how climate adaptation and disaster response is funded. So I know you might have a little bit of experience with this, Dana, because I know some of your programs balance several different types of funding streets, and I think you might have experience with this too, Wilson. So I'm interested if you all can speak to how your programs have balanced different funding streams, and was time an issue when you were balancing these different sources of funding, and how did you navigate that?
Certainly, I can just briefly touch on the fact that time is always going to be that limiter. It's a challenging place to be in when we have so much need in our community and we're struggling to bring those dollars in and then manage those. So I think getting people on the team that are really well versed in compliance and figuring out how to stay compliant, make sure our programs are addressing the requirements that they have in place, and then empowering people to be a part of that bigger mission, I think has been a really nice part of this. People that share the same goals and then want to effectively administer these dollars in a way that makes the most community impact. And I think the tough part is that a lot of housing and climate haven't really been hand in hand as much as I think they should be. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to better connect things like tracking energy burden. That's something that we're going to be slowly working on to really figure out what structural intervention impact is happening for that homeowner and how can we quantify that and then sell that as another layer. But yes, time is always going to be the tough thing about managing these types of funds and figuring out how to do it the most effective way to make the greatest community impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think timing is a big issue no matter what, right? Because everything is timing. The person that you meet and fall in love with is timing, and the deal that you put together is timing. And there's never enough resources, as Dana so eloquently said, like 2.5 billion to stabilize her building stock there alone. There's never enough resources. to do what we need to do. We have a gas leak in our biggest complex, 385 occupied units. And right now, nearly 1,000 people have no stoves. And we just had temporary boilers brought in for domestic hot water. So we're going electric. It's not ideal time. We're headed into the winter, but this is when the tragedy strikes, right? It's 5 o'clock on a Friday. It's heading into winter. So the timing issue is never easy, but it's yet another challenge to overcome, something more to face and deal with. I think what I look for in a team of people is people who can problem solve. Like, you could be in housing, which is what I'm in currently, but you could be building widgets or making nuclear submarines or, launching rockets to the moon. The person who has the best team is the person who can problem solve their way through whatever crisis comes at you. And so you want to make sure that you're talking to people who can problem solve no matter what is thrown at you and how much time you have.
Great, thank you both. Moving on a little bit from funding, we had one question actually about community land trusts, which I love seeing community land trusts come up in our climate-related conversations. So this person asked, what is your take on community land trusts in helping to address the issue of housing equity in New York? And we can go ahead and say it more broadly because, Dana, I know you're not in New York. So any takes on community land trusts and how their work may relate to equity or even climate readiness?
In New York, we looked, when I was planning commissioner in Yonkers, a city of 200,000, third largest in the state. We looked at community land trusts. We tried to get some property into some community land trusts. That was not as successful as we would have liked. I liked what Dana said about there's so much need for infill. I mean, she's in Memphis, I'm in Yonkers, New York, and we have huge needs for infill housing. And there's all that vacant property. And luckily for me, my mayor and his deputy mayor just contacted me this week, which I guess is like Monday, and said, we have some properties that we're going to be transferring to you. They're vacant properties because the housing that was there burned down or whatever, got knocked down a century ago. And it's sort of like an empty lot in the middle of nothing. So we'd like you to build some affordable housing. And I'm thrilled to pieces that he's like thought of this and taken the leadership on this. And I think more communities need to do that.
And I think too, that's a great point, Wilson. And I think community land trusts offer a really great opportunity for community ownership and voice in how that land gets used. So I think it's a really wonderful way for us to use the authority of an entity that might be able to hold land or make decisions about what goes on that land. And then it's less offensive for a government agency to come in and do some of that, because there is a lot of displacement work that we're trying to do, but also like, how do we build these inclusive communities, but also not concentrate poverty? So how do we make sure that the long-term residents are valued and allowed to safely stay in the neighborhoods that they have multi-generational connections to? And I think community land trusts allow us to better hear what those folks down the block want on that property. And I think it might be a great model, and it might be successful in different ways and unsuccessful in different places, depending, to Wilson's point that, it may not work, but it may, if the right people are there and the right community activators are interested in advancing the work and partnering with the public sector, I think it's a potentially transformative way for communities to really drive what that infill looks like and what kind of affordability periods, for instance, are left on those homes. So.
And that's
Absolutely.
the affordability
period.
period.
Oh, sorry.
No, the affordability period is a huge, is a huge driver of why that is so important. Because obviously, my mayor wants that as a lien on the property because he wants the affordability period to be 20 or 30 years, but not every mayor may feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to make sure that you keep it affordable for more than, like one term of some elected person, right?
Exactly.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, not at all. I mean, exactly. I was going to say we're very interested here at the lab and the Furman Center to learn more about how different kinds of ownership, and especially collective ownership or social housing, relates to climate resilience. I know there's been some research around resident-owned cooperatives, especially of manufactured housing, and how they may make those communities, which tend to be especially vulnerable, more resilient, but there's much more research to be done, I think. And we are actually just reaching time now. So I will take the liberty of wrapping us up now. Thank you to everyone who responded to our poll. We got a great response rate, so thank you for that. We'd also like to invite you to tell us about your partnerships and initiatives and experiences. So please click that link that I just shared to participate in a follow-up survey so we can learn about you and your challenges and experiences. We'd just love to hear more. And with that, a huge thank you to our panelists. Thanks, Aisha, for a great presentation. And we look forward to involving you all in our ongoing climate work at the lab. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.